The ghost of Miller's Creek. At the edge of Miller's Creek Village today, people suddenly discovered a burnt, blackened corpse that was unrecognizable. The body was about 5 feet tall, with a slender build and some wisps of slightly curly long hair. Only after close examination could one speculate that this burnt individual was likely a very young woman. The villagers crowded around the spot, surrounding it densely. No one knew why this corpse was here, or why the woman's body had been so cruelly and brutally burnt. When he heard the villagers' reports, Mr. Johnson, the town supervisor in charge of public affairs, quickly appeared on the scene. His face was flushed red and he was panting for breath. It seemed he had just come from a drunken stupor before arriving here. "Everyone get back to make way, so the authorities like me can handle this," Mr. Johnson yelled loudly, stumbling and swaying as if about to fall over at any moment. As soon as Mr. Johnson's face appeared, the villagers immediately swarmed him, clamoring to tell their accounts. One man, gesturing wildly at the corpse, spat as he spoke agitatedly. "This morning when I was leading my ox from my house to the pasture, I saw the corpse already lying here. Poor burnt soul. I wonder what evil, brutal fiend could have done something so vicious." Another man, holding a rope tied to an ox, pointed at the corpse and said, "Last night I saw flames blazing brightly where the body is. I thought someone was burning straw there. Turns out they were burning a person, not straw." A sour-faced woman also chimed in. "Looking at this body shape, it must be someone from another village, not our own. After all, no one in our village would dare go out to the fields at night like this." Mr. Johnson shook his head vigorously a few times, trying to clear the alcohol-induced haze. Then he suddenly yelled loudly, "Quiet, everyone! You're all just rambling aimlessly about nothing relevant." After speaking, Mr. Johnson looked around frantically as if searching for someone. Then he suddenly grabbed the shoulder of a man and laughed excitedly as he called out, "Quentin, get over here. Cordon off this whole area for me. I need to go report this to the county office. Hurry up. We can't have villagers leading their oxen through here and contaminating the crime scene." A man emerged from the crowd, the one Mr. Johnson had gestured towards. He was a young man of about 22, with a broad back and tall stature. His name was Quentin Miller, one of the village militia volunteers. Quentin had dropped out of school early and was illiterate, only doing odd jobs as a plasterer and painter around the county. When the militia was recruiting, Mr. Johnson immediately enlisted Quentin because of his brawn and obedient nature. Hearing Mr. Johnson call him, Quentin had been crouching in a corner observing the corpse, but now sprang to his feet and shambled over. His head was tilted slightly, seeming not to comprehend. Seeing Quentin's confusion, Mr. Johnson reiterated, "Cordon off the scene for me. Use some rope and wooden stakes to block off the four corners so people can't lead their oxen through. Then disperse the crowd." Quentin straightened his back and yelled loudly, "Yes, sir, Mr. Johnson, I'll get right on it." Mr. Johnson flinched slightly at Quentin's animated response. He glared sideways at Quentin briefly. Then he looked over the villagers and said, "All right, everyone return home now. And if you need to take your oxen to pasture, remember to detour around this area, understand? Otherwise, I'll call the county police to haul you off and lock you up for days or weeks. Obstructing a crime scene makes you an accomplice to the criminals." After speaking, Mr. Johnson strode off unsteadily towards his bicycle parked near a jujube tree. Earlier, when he had seen the dense crowd around the corpse, he had hastily parked his bike against the tree trunk so he could rush to investigate. Mr. Johnson climbed onto the bicycle and pedaled out of sight down the village dirt path. After Mr. Johnson left, Quentin also began hammering wooden stakes into the ground. Then he started stringing rope around them to cordon off the scene. It wasn't until noon that Mr. Johnson returned, this time accompanied by a group of people from the county office, including the county chairman, vice chairman, secretary, and the township police chief who had come to investigate. Upon hearing of a villager's death, the county office had also dispatched county-level police to investigate. but they wouldn't arrive until evening. In the meantime, the county ordered the township to secure the crime scene and gather information to brief the investigators when they arrived. Mr. Johnson was elated to have this opportunity. He busily scurried around the village, questioning people, hoping to dig up clues that would give him a chance to gain recognition. All of Millers Creek Village was in turmoil. Villagers whispered to each other, "This burnt corpse looks exactly like the one from last year around New Year's, which was also completely charred black." But that incident happened in Willow Creek Village, not ours. I heard Willow Creek also had several similar deaths the past few months, with no known cause. Now it seems the events have spread from there into our village, others said. I've heard that before each burnt death, people in Willow Creek smell a strange, awful stench, not quite like burning plastic or anything else. Yet another villager nodded and said, "Our village has always had a custom forbidding anyone from going out at night. That's when the ghosts come out to snatch people. In the past we had deaths like this, so people are very wary. This burnt corpse definitely isn't one of our villagers." The villagers kept murmuring and gossiping anxiously until evening, when the county finally sent down an investigative team of 3 officers. One was Police Lieutenant Eric, one was Detective Ryan, and the third was a rather young and beautiful policewoman, Detective Kevin. The 3 were from the county's Criminal Investigation Department, sent to initiate the investigation. If they couldn't find any leads, they would have to invite the provincial and national police forces to assist, as this was no trivial matter. Willow Creek Village had seen numerous unexplained burnt corpse cases over the years. Now the events seemed to be spreading into Millers Creek Village next door, further unnerving the residents. Several families had even abandoned the village and moved to the highlands to get away. When Mr. Johnson heard 3 officers were coming, he was overjoyed. He rushed to greet them at the village entrance, smiling and shaking their hands excitedly. Lieutenant Eric got out of the car first, walking ahead of the other 2 towards the crime scene to inspect it. Detective Ryan drove the car around to the side, while Detective Kevin carried a briefcase under her arm, holding a notebook to record the case details. Mr. Johnson was delighted to have this chance. He stuck close behind Lieutenant Eric, chattering away. "Now that the 3 of you are here to investigate, I've already gathered intel from all over the village. No one is missing from our village, so the burnt corpse must be from another village, not ours." Hearing Mr. Johnson's explanation, Lieutenant Eric fell deep in thought, as if considering some issue. He entered the crime scene, put on rubber gloves, and began examining the corpse very meticulously. This was the corpse of a woman. Based on some of her belongings, she looked to be around 22 or 23 years old. Her feet were in high heels, half of which had burnt black. She had on a pair of glasses, now nearly burnt away. The initial examination showed that this woman was likely knocked out with a blow to the back of the neck before the perpetrator set her body ablaze. Moreover, she was burnt alive rather than killed first. Detective Kevin stood to the side, taking notes about the scene. When she finished, she came over next to Lieutenant Eric and whispered in his ear, "This case is identical to the 3 previous ones in Willow Creek. The circumstances are unchanged. The odd thing is the previous Willow Creek cases all involved missing people, while this incident happened in Millers Creek, but the victim isn't from this village." Lieutenant Eric nodded and said, "That's right. The common thread is the killer's murder method. This is likely the work of a religious fanatic. We opened case file DT-26 on this 3 months ago, but still have no leads to identify the perpetrator." Detective Ryan had just gotten out of the car. He swept his eyes over the corpse and looked at Lieutenant Eric. "The difficulty is that the victims don't seem to have any conflicts with anyone, and this killer seems to murder just as a warped hobby." Lieutenant Eric shook his head in disagreement. "I don't think it's just a hobby. The perpetrator specifically targets very young women around 5'5". The height is a consistent pattern." Detective Kevin suddenly thought of something. She said, Or maybe the killer wanted to get this woman in Willow Creek, but events went beyond his plans, so the victim escaped here. Then, afraid of exposure, he ruthlessly killed her right in this spot. Lieutenant Eric nodded. Your reasoning is very plausible. Highly likely. Detective Kevin also nodded in agreement. That's right. Going undercover is the best approach. Also, to avoid the killer's suspicion, we should stake out right here in Miller's Creek, not Willow Creek. If we stay here, the Willow Creek murderer won't know. This case of his victim slipping away to Miller's Creek was probably just a mistake on his part, Detective Ryan asked. So what about this corpse? Lieutenant Eric contemplatively responded after a moment. First, we'll send the victim's body to the medical examiner's office for identification. Concurrently, someone should covertly check Willow Creek to see if any locals are missing, avoiding our cover being blown. Hearing Lieutenant Eric's arrangements, the other two fully agreed to follow his lead. After that, the three of them left the crime scene together, taking the corpse to the police station. Two days later, the three returned secretly in plain clothes. They disguised themselves as fruit sellers with a cart of oranges at the village entrance. Then they casually asked around to rent an empty house in the village for operational convenience. But unfortunately for them, they couldn't rent that house because the owner was severely ill and his family refused them. Ultimately left with no other choice, that night Mr. Johnson was summoned by Lieutenant Eric's team to the village cultural center to discuss matters. Seeing Lieutenant Eric's people, Mr. Johnson was initially a bit suspicious. After all, he had only met them once briefly before they immediately left. This time, Lieutenant Eric's team was in plain clothes and hadn't introduced themselves at the cultural center, so Mr. Johnson mistook them for Sarikers. Only when Lieutenant Eric pulled him aside and secretly whispered the superior's classified orders did Mr. Johnson realize who they were. Oh, so you're the county police officers? I didn't recognize you all. Lieutenant Eric put his index finger to his lips and softly shushed. Keep your voice down. Blowing our cover now won't do. We need you to arrange temporary lodging in the village for our stakeout. Absolute secrecy. Understand? Mr. Johnson was a bit stunned, then seemed to comprehend. He eagerly and excitedly said, "No problem at all. You all can stay at my home for a few days." He then turned around, pulling Lieutenant Eric's hand to follow him. But Lieutenant Eric stopped him and said, "We can't go with you yet tonight. We still need to investigate covertly this evening. Come back here to pick us up to stay at your home around 10 p.m. Hearing this, Mr. Johnson disagreed anxiously. He waved his hands, saying, "No, that won't do. Villagers have a custom of not going out at night for fear of the haunts. You gentlemen should come with me home to rest. Then you can investigate early tomorrow morning." Hearing Mr. Johnson say this, Detective Ryan curiously licked his lips and asked, "Haunts? What are these haunts the villagers fear so much?" Lieutenant Eric also shook his head in disbelief. "This concerns a murder case. No joking around. Don't make things up with us," Mr. Johnson insisted anxiously. "I'm telling the truth, not joking. This village has an old legend about those creatures, and my family's observed the taboo for generations, never violating it." Detective Kevin was also very intrigued by this. She said, "Then tell us the full story in detail, please. The more specifics, the better." Mr. Johnson looked around nervously for a bit, then said, "Oh, all right, I'll tell the tale. But it's nearly nightfall already, almost the forbidden time in the village. Just come to my home first and we'll talk inside after dinner when the doors are shut." Seeing Mr. Johnson so insistently maintain his stance, Lieutenant Eric's team felt they had no other choice but to acquiesce. They followed Mr. Johnson to his home. Upon arriving at the house, Mr. Johnson's wife Sarah saw her husband bringing three very young strangers home and speaking so politely to them. She immediately knew these were honored guests. Without waiting for her husband's instructions, Sarah quickly slaughtered a chicken and prepared a full feast to treat the visitors. When Sarah finished making dinner, she brought the dishes upstairs just as the sky outside went pitch black. Sarah put the chicken in the coop, then shut the courtyard and house doors. She called for her daughter Lily to stop threshing rice outside and quickly come bolt the upstairs doors. The whole family gathered around the dinner table, where Mr. Johnson's wife Sarah had prepared many homemade countryside dishes to treat Lieutenant Eric, Detective Kevin, and Detective Ryan. As the dinner proceeded, Detective Ryan finished scooping a chicken piece into his bowl, then set his chopsticks down beside the table. He looked at Mr. Johnson impatiently and asked, "All right, now we're all inside following the village custom. Can you tell us the tale?" Lieutenant Eric and Detective Kevin also stopped eating entirely, staring intently at Mr. Johnson, waiting for his explanation. Mr. Johnson wiped his mouth with his chopsticks several times to clean off the grease. Then he slowly stroked his beard and said, "I told the county folks, but they didn't believe me. Thought we Millers Creek villagers were superstitious. But this is truly real. It's been passed down since my great-grandfather's time, and no one has ever dared violate it. Those who tried are now dead and can't recount their experience." Mr. Johnson's daughter Lily, sitting next to her dad, also nodded and chimed in. "That's right, sirs and ma'ams. When I was little, I even saw the haunt snatch someone before." Lieutenant Eric grew a bit nervous. His voice urgent, he pressed, "What are these haunts? Explain clearly so we understand. Don't keep speaking so cryptically. We have no idea what you're talking about." Mr. Johnson laughed and scratched his head and ears. "I have to start from the beginning for it to make sense. Lily, go inside and grab Grandpa and Grandma's old photos to show them." Hearing her dad call, Lily immediately set her bowl down and nimbly stood up, running into the bedroom to grab a stack of old black and white photos. She handed them to Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson took the photo stack, sipped some strong liquor, making his face wrinkle, then began recounting. "There's been lore about the haunts here for ages, since my great-grandfather's time. We still only know it's a taboo tradition with an unclear origin. I heard it stems from the karma of our ancestral lineage's founder, who cleared this land. He unfairly stole lots of wealth when alive. So after death, the netherworld sent haunts to seize all his descendants to eliminate his lineage. That alone wouldn't be worth mentioning. But rumor says after this man's descendants died, they falsely reported the wrong names. So the haunts snatched the wrong people randomly, terrorizing the whole village. Eventually, they disregarded names and just took any villager out at night." Mr. Johnson's wife, Sarah, also chimed in. "That's right, sirs. The way people died from the haunts was terrifying. Their mouths stretched wide open, faces all pallid and lifeless. I had a cousin who broke the rule and went out drinking one night. The moment he got to the gate, he just collapsed dead with his teeth bared." Lily added, "After he died, the haunts still wouldn't leave us alone. Every night his family heard his voice calling to open the door, the haunts impersonating him to lure people outside and snatch them. So scary." Mr. Johnson nodded slightly and continued, "I heard other areas also have haunts. They appear when someone just died in a home, often shape-shifting into birds perching on the fence. Then at night when people are sound asleep, they impersonate relatives or friends calling them outside. If you respond at all, you die immediately." As Mr. Johnson spoke, he held up the photo stack, gesturing as he narrated, "Here, this is my grandmother, also Lily's great-grandmother. Lily saw with her own eyes the haunts snatch someone that day. Lily, tell them the details." Mr. Johnson urged Lily to recount the full events. Lily quickly drank a spoonful of soup, then began eloquently. "It's true, sirs and ma'am. That day, Great-Grandma was desperately demanding to fetch water outside by the front gate. She claimed she heard Grandpa calling for help, saying to hurry out otherwise the haunts would seize and kill Grandpa. But Grandpa was clearly still fast asleep inside. Yet Great-Grandma was possessed, hell-bent on rushing out. And then, oh dear, the moment she got just several steps outside, I saw a blaze of fire by the fence. It lunged at Great-Grandma, and she just collapsed in the yard, mouth stretched wide open, eyes huge, face all pallid like a drowned corpse. My parents were both gone that day. Only Grandma and Grandpa were home. I was little and didn't understand anything. Just wanted to drag Great-Grandma inside, but my grandparents wouldn't allow it. It wasn't until the next morning that someone dared go out and retrieve Great-Grandma's body for funeral preparations. Hearing Lily vividly and adamantly recounting this, Lieutenant Eric's team felt a slight chill down their spines, despite having faced many horrifying crime scenes before. After a while, Detective Ryan voiced his disbelief. Country folk often have coincidental superstitions. Your great-grandma could have simply had a stroke rather than being snatched by haunts. Detective Kevin also wiped some sweat and calmly analyzed, "Regarding the case details, the victim isn't from this village. Very likely the killer fears this legend of haunts snatching people, so doesn't dare go on a rampage in Miller's Creek. We can use this story as an ideal cover to secretly hide out here, then each night covertly investigate Willow Creek. We'll certainly find clues." Lieutenant Eric nodded in agreement with the two and said, "Whether this case gets resolved hinges critically on now." Over 3 months, the time between murders has gotten shorter and shorter. The second murder was a month after the first, the third 2 weeks after that, the fourth just a week after. The intervals keep halving like a pattern. By that calculation, tonight the killer will surely strike again. Detective Kevin nodded and added, "The coroner determined the girl last night died around 9 p.m., so it's highly likely the killer will act again around that time tonight." Detective Ryan also said, "Then after eating quickly, we still need to immediately investigate Willow Creek to have a chance." Hearing the three speak like this, Mr. Johnson anxiously waved his hands in refusal. "You absolutely cannot do that. What we've told you is true. Even if you don't believe it, you shouldn't go. What if something happens? How will I explain to the county authorities?" Lieutenant Eric smiled calmly to reassure Mr. Johnson. "Someone from the township office will report in your stead. We're police officers. We won't be shaken by a few superstitious tales. Now is the critical moment. The killer is about to strike. If we don't stop him, it's tantamount to being complicit in murder. Therefore, even if we're harmed by these so-called haunts you describe, we still must go." Mr. Johnson sighed, knowing he couldn't dissuade the three's decision. He could only advise them with a few words. "The haunts snatch people for a reason. It's fine if you all go out at night, but within this village's bounds, absolutely don't utter a single word. Only speak after leaving the village. And if you hear someone calling, don't believe it's real. If you see someone injured or in trouble, just ignore them. Pretend you don't see anything." Knowing he couldn't agree with Mr. Johnson, yet hearing him prattle on, Lieutenant Eric rolled his eyes and firmly promised just to placate him, "All right, we won't say anything or help anyone. Don't worry. When it's pitch black tonight, we'll come back for you to let us in the house." Mr. Johnson waved his hand, saying, "I wouldn't dare open the door either. Here, take these photos. When you come back, slip them through the door crack and knock. I'll see them and open up for you all." Lieutenant Eric took the photos and carefully tucked them in his shirt pocket so they wouldn't fall out. After eating, the three began fully arming themselves to stake out the killer in Willow Creek. Exiting Mr. Johnson's home, they immediately strode quickly towards Willow Creek. Since no one in Miller's Creek dared go out at night like this, the three didn't need to hide themselves from being spotted while moving. They swaggered openly on the village paths. The night road was desolate and empty. Only faint light from some households spilled out. There were no streetlights. The three had to walk close together to avoid getting separated, and they strained to stay completely silent, not making any noise. Despite not really believing Mr. Johnson's ominous warnings, the three still tried to leave Miller Creek's bounds before whispering to each other, "It's 8 p.m. already, nearing the killer's attack time. What are your guesses? Where will he strike now?" Lieutenant Eric sat next to a bush, carefully analyzing and speaking. Detectives Kevin and Ryan also carefully considered, then offered their thoughts. The previous corpses were all discovered by the Riverside Levee, so this time it'll likely happen there too. Detective Kevin stated this definitively, but Lieutenant Eric disagreed. I think differently. The way he burns the victims seems like some ritual. He likely belongs to an occult religion, fervently worshipping Satan, for instance. His patterned murders may be to summon a demon for personal gain, so he'll choose somewhere secluded and hidden. Too windy by the river, he'd be caught burning corpses there. Detective Ryan furrowed his brows perplexedly and asked, "But clearly every corpse has appeared at the levee, right? If not there, where could he commit the crimes?" Lieutenant Eric rapped Detective Ryan's head chidingly. "You're so dense. Don't you know killers can create false crime scenes?" Detective Ryan shook his head. "It's not that I don't know that, but he can't falsify a scene when the very ground is burnt. Unless..." Detective Ryan stopped mid-sentence, looking horrified to continue speaking. Lieutenant Eric meanwhile nodded, completing Detective Ryan's speculation. "You've reasoned it out perfectly. The killer immolates victims alive, then forces them to move while engulfed in raging flames. Extremely brutal." Detective Kevin swallowed hard. She felt a tinge of disgust at such a method. But ultimately, as a policewoman, that fleeting sensation was quickly overwhelmed and vanished from her thoughts. It was 8:45 p.m., precisely 15 minutes until the killer's expected attack window. The three still hadn't deduced his chosen crime scene. Finally, they reluctantly agreed that despite the levee not being the initial murder site, the killer may still be spotted there. If they acted swiftly enough, they could still save the victim from burning and apprehend the perpetrator. The plans were quickly finalized. The three hid in an abandoned levee hut, carefully awaiting the killer's potential appearance. As they anticipated, albeit 1 minute later than expected, the killer did indeed emerge, and horrifically, the victim also appeared, engulfed in raging flames just as Lieutenant Eric initially reasoned. A middle-aged man drove a pickup truck, throwing the bound victim in the truck bed. Midway on the levee, he tilted the truck again to dump the girl onto the ground. Meticulously, he then swept away all the truck's tire tracks with a broom. Bang! Unable to wait any longer, Lieutenant Eric fired the first shot to launch the assault. As planned, Detective Ryan rushed to rescue the girl, already prepared with a soaked blanket that he flung over her to smother the flames. Everything happened extremely quickly. Detective Kevin charged up, pointing her gun at the man in the pickup truck cabin to force him to surrender. But the bastard was reckless. Even at gunpoint, he stomped the accelerator to peel away out of Detective Kevin's range. Bang! Bang! Detective Kevin fired 2 more shots, but they only seemed to wound the killer's arm without stopping his escape. Lieutenant Eric approached to jump on the truck bed, but the killer swiftly tilted it again, causing him to stumble backwards. "Fu Ming," Lieutenant Eric cursed loudly. "Damn it! Almost had the bastard." The pickup truck gradually disappeared down the dark levee. Detective Ryan had succeeded in extinguishing the flames and saving the burnt girl, though she was still gravely injured. Detective Ryan propped her up and quickly questioned the semi-conscious victim about the killer. "Miss, do you remember his face? Do you know who he is?" The girl whispered faintly, trembling all over. "I do." After uttering those 2 words, she collapsed unconscious. Detective Ryan kept shaking her but couldn't rouse her. Lieutenant Eric interjected, "Stop it, Ryan. Can't you see she's exhausted? For now, carry her to the clinic. We'll take turns guarding her tonight. I'm certain the killer knows she's alive and will try to finish the job." Detective Kevin also agreed, saying, "Then let Detective Ryan watch her until around 2 a.m. We'll return to Miller's Creek to rest, taking shifts keeping guard. By morning, the county will certainly send an ambulance to bring her to the county hospital for treatment." Detective Ryan nodded. "Sounds good. You two go back and rest first. I'll keep watch over her. If anything comes up, I'll call you. Don't turn your phones off." After speaking, Detective Ryan ran towards the township clinic carrying the girl. The clinic was located right at the edge of Miller's Creek, also bordering Willow Creek. If anything happened, Detective Ryan just had to call, and Lieutenant Eric and Detective Kevin could arrive swiftly to assist. Watching Detective Ryan's figure disappear, Lieutenant Eric grinned at Detective Kevin and said, "Great, Detective Ryan's gone. Now we can be more intimate with each other." Detective Kevin suddenly blushed a little. "When will you publicly announce our relationship? And you're hiding it from Detective Ryan too." Lieutenant Eric booped Detective Kevin's cute little nose flirtatiously. "I'm not scared. What are you afraid of? Just worried my gorgeous girlfriend will get too many suitors and leave me." Detective Kevin shyly turned her head, pretending not to talk to Lieutenant Eric. He laughed and rushed over to hold her hand as they walked towards Miller's Creek. Unbeknownst to them, the escaped pickup truck had looped back around. Inside, the man smoked cigarette after cigarette, the ashes dropping everywhere. He watched the two figures disappear into the night, an oddly icy look in his eyes. Arriving at Miller's Creek, Lieutenant Eric and Detective Kevin still held hands, exchanging flirtatious glances. They strolled into the village path, leisurely gazing at the stars overhead. Amidst this romantic moment, Detective Kevin suddenly noticed an old woman collapse by the pond next to the path. She turned to Lieutenant Eric. "Lieutenant Eric, it looks like someone fell over there." He also glanced in the direction Detective Kevin indicated and nodded. "You're right, an old lady did fall." But Detective Kevin quickly grabbed his hand, reminding, "Remember Mr. Johnson's warning. If we see others in trouble, we can't help or we may get snatched by the haunts." Lieutenant Eric suddenly laughed, tapping Detective Kevin's forehead and saying affectionately, "You're a cop, but believe in superstitions like that? Want me reporting to HQ that you'll never get promoted?" Detective Kevin smiled charmingly, baring her pretty teeth. Her tiny eyes crinkled happily as she retorted, "Then let's break up." Lieutenant Eric pretended to be aghast, glaring at her sideways. "Oh, you dare!" Detective Kevin covered her mouth laughing, then waved her hand. "All right, no more joking. So are we helping the old lady or not?" Lieutenant Eric puffed out his chest definitively. "We'll help, of course." He rolled up his sleeves and bustled over to the old woman. Helping her up, he asked, "Heavens, what are you doing out here so late? Our village has some haunt taboo, right? Falling like this, do your kids even know?" Seeing Lieutenant Eric speak to the old woman like that, Detective Kevin covered her mouth, laughing amusedly from the path side. Noticing her laughter, Lieutenant Eric called out, "Hey, Missy, why not come help the granny instead of just standing there giggling? How rude." Detective Kevin kept laughing shyly. She started towards Lieutenant Eric and the old woman to assist. But after just 2 steps, her smile suddenly vanished entirely, replaced by a horrified expression. Helping the old woman, Lieutenant Eric noticed Detective Kevin's face and anxiously asked, "Detective Kevin, what's wrong?" Detective Kevin stammered, speaking haltingly. She pointed a shaky hand. "Lieutenant Eric, the old lady, she's not human." After uttering those words, Detective Kevin looked ready to faint. Lieutenant Eric laughed, thinking she was just easily spooked. He said, "All right, human or not, I invite the young miss to come help anyway." Detective Kevin just gaped open-mouthed, seemingly wanting to speak, but unable to get the words out. Lieutenant Eric suddenly glanced back and also froze in shock. Oh, heavens. The old woman's face had pitch-black eyes and an open mouth bearing long, disgustingly jagged fangs. Horrified, Lieutenant Eric immediately shoved her away. But oddly, her frail arm clutched his body tightly, immobilizing him. His whole body stiffened, legs shaking too much to walk. Bang! At that critical moment, Detective Kevin fired a bullet like a lifesaver. Lieutenant Eric instantly felt relieved. The arm holding him had vanished. Turning back, The old woman was nowhere to be seen. Terrified, he grabbed Detective Kevin's hand and sprinted toward Mr. Johnson's home. Arriving there, he quickly pulled out the photo from his chest pocket, planning to slip it under the door. Only now, carefully looking at it, the old woman in the picture was the exact one he and Detective Kevin had just encountered. Lieutenant Eric pounded the door, hastily stuffing the photo through the gap and yelling, "Mr. Johnson, open up, hurry!" Hearing the loud knocks, Mr. Johnson was slightly startled, but mentally prepared. Spotting the photo slipped beneath the door, he confirmed it was Lieutenant Eric's team. Mr. Johnson hurriedly unlatched the lock and heaved the door aside. Opening up, he saw Lieutenant Eric and Detective Kevin's figures behind the door. Their hair was disheveled as if they'd encountered something terrifying, still panting heavily. Seeing them, Mr. Johnson immediately guessed what happened. He anxiously glanced outside, then urged them, "Get inside, quick!" Lieutenant Eric nodded, pulling Detective Kevin along as they entered. Right as they stepped in, Mr. Johnson also slammed the door shut. Outside in the yard, a shadowy figure was lumbering towards the door. Oblivious, Mr. Johnson didn't notice the photo Lieutenant Eric had slipped under the door to prove their identity was now slowly getting dragged back out through the gap, disappearing outside.